The morning of December 12, 2022, began like any other in Beverly Hills. The sun cast its golden rays over the sprawling mansions, and the air buzzed faintly with the hum of luxury cars gliding along palm-lined streets. But the calm was shattered when a frantic 911 call came from the home of Jonathan Everett, one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors. "There's been a break-in," his voice trembled over the line. "And, she's not breathing. My secretary, Rachel, she's dead." Within minutes, the police arrived at the Everett estate, a modern architectural marvel perched atop the hills, overlooking Los Angeles. Officers moved quickly past the ornate gates and into the house, where they found the lifeless body of Rachel Dawson, sprawled on the marble floor of the living room. A pool of blood stained the pristine surface beneath her, a chilling contrast to the elegance of the surroundings. Jonathan stood nearby, his face pale, his hands visibly shaking. He repeated the same phrases over and over. "I came home, the door was open. I didn't know." His words trailed off as he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. The scene was chaotic, but something about it felt off to Detective Samuel Carter, a seasoned investigator who had seen countless crime scenes during his career. "Where's your wife, Mr. Everett?" Carter asked, his sharp eyes scanning Jonathan's expression. She's upstairs," Jonathan stammered. "She doesn't know. I didn't want to wake her." But Laura Everett, Jonathan's wife, was far from unaware. Upstairs in their master bedroom, she sat in silence, staring out the window as the sirens wailed below. Her fingers gripped the edge of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She had known something was wrong, she'd felt it brewing for months, maybe even years. And now, it seemed, the storm had finally broken. As the crime scene investigators documented the evidence, whispers of the incident began spreading. By mid-morning, the news had hit the tabloids, and the headlines were merciless: "Hollywood scandal, director's secret affair ends in tragedy." Just the day before, the Everetts had seemed like the epitome of success and glamour. Jonathan Everett, with his string of Academy Award-winning films, was hailed as a genius in Hollywood. His wife, Lillian Everett, was equally adored, a philanthropist and socialite known for her poise and beauty. Together, they were the kind of couple whose photographs graced magazine covers and whose presence at charity galas drew envy and admiration. But beneath the surface, their marriage had been cracking. Jonathan's late nights at the studio had turned into early morning absences. His once affectionate demeanor had grown distant, replaced by clipped conversations and the hollow excuse of work stress. Lillian had tried to ignore it, even as her intuition whispered that something was terribly wrong. She had buried herself in her charity work, plastering on a smile for the cameras while privately feeling the weight of loneliness and betrayal. It was during this time that Rachel Dawson had entered their lives. A fresh-faced graduate with a sharp mind and ambitious spirit, Rachel had quickly become indispensable to Jonathan as his personal assistant. She managed his schedule, handled his calls, and eventually became the person he confided in about his frustrations. At first, it had been innocent, a professional bond between a mentor and his protégé. But slowly, lines blurred. Rachel became more than just an assistant, she became Jonathan's escape. As Detective Carter pieced together the timeline of events, he couldn't ignore the oddities surrounding the case. There was no sign of forced entry. The alarm system had been disarmed from inside. And while Jonathan insisted he had found Rachel dead upon arriving home, there were no clear indications of a break-in. "Do you have any idea who might want to harm Ms. Dawson?" Carter asked Jonathan in the expansive living room, now cordoned off with yellow tape. "No," Jonathan replied too quickly. His eyes darted away as he rubbed his temples. She was well-liked. I mean, as far as I know. And yet she was here," Carter said, his voice calm but probing. "Late at night, in your home. Why?" Jonathan hesitated, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. "She was working late on some scripts," he lied, his tone unconvincing. That's all. Upstairs, Lillian watched from the window as the media began gathering outside the gates. Their perfect life, meticulously curated for public consumption, was now under siege. The whispers, the rumors, the lies, it was all unraveling. And in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning. The Everetts had everything most people could ever dream of: fame, fortune, and influence. Their sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills was not just a home but a symbol of their success. The press called them a power couple, a term that seemed to embody their polished public image. Yet, within the walls of their grand estate, the reality was far from perfect. Jonathan Everett, hailed as a genius filmmaker, was a man under relentless pressure. For years, his creativity had fueled a string of box office hits, earning him accolades and admiration. But with each success came an even greater weight to outdo himself. The demands of Hollywood, coupled with the scrutiny of the media, had worn him down. Jonathan often found solace not in the arms of his wife but in his work, where he could momentarily escape the mounting cracks in his personal life. Lillian Everett, on the other hand, had built her identity around being Jonathan's unwavering support. A former model turned philanthropist, she dedicated herself to causes that painted her as a beacon of grace and compassion. She chaired galas, hosted charity events, and graced magazine covers with her effortless elegance. To the outside world, she was the epitome of a perfect wife. But inside, she was crumbling. Jonathan's increasing absences were no longer just professional, they felt deliberate. Lillian noticed the subtle shifts, the way he avoided eye contact during dinner, how he spent more time on his phone, the new cologne he never bothered to explain. She convinced herself it was just stress. After all, his latest film was in production, and the stakes were higher than ever. Yet, the doubt lingered, like an invisible thread pulling at her heart. It was during this tumultuous period that Rachel Dawson entered the Everetts' lives. Rachel was everything Jonathan admired: sharp, efficient, and refreshingly unburdened by the expectations that came with his world. Fresh out of graduate school, Rachel had landed the job as Jonathan's assistant not through connections but through sheer determination. She worked tirelessly, often going above and beyond what was required, and quickly earned Jonathan's trust. At first, Lillian saw Rachel as a harmless addition to her husband's team. Rachel's bright smile and professional demeanor gave no cause for concern. But as weeks turned into months, Lillian began to sense something was different. Rachel was no longer just a name on the payroll, she was always present, handling Jonathan's calls, accompanying him to late-night meetings, and even rearranging their family plans to suit his schedule. For Rachel, the allure of working with a director of Jonathan's caliber was intoxicating. He wasn't just her boss, he was her mentor, someone who appreciated her ideas and gave her a taste of the high-stakes world she had always dreamed of. Over time, admiration grew into something deeper. Rachel found herself drawn to Jonathan, not just for his talent but for the vulnerability he revealed when he spoke about the pressures of his life. She saw a side of him that Lillian no longer did, or perhaps had stopped looking for. By summer 2022, the emotional distance between Jonathan and Lillian had become palpable. They no longer shared quiet moments in the mornings, no longer laughed at old inside jokes. Jonathan's excuses became routine: "I have a late meeting," or "the studio needs me tonight." Lillian stopped questioning him. What was the point when the answers only deepened the void? Lillian's intuition, however, refused to be silenced. One evening in July, she found herself walking past Jonathan's study. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, she saw him sitting on the couch, phone in hand, smiling at something, or someone. Her heart sank. The man she had built a life with was slipping away, and she had no idea how to stop it. Jonathan, too, felt the weight of his choices. His affair with Rachel was never part of the plan, it had started with small moments: a shared laugh, a late-night coffee run, an accidental touch that lingered just a second too long. He knew it was wrong, but Rachel offered something he hadn't felt in years: admiration without expectation. She didn't see him as a husband or a Hollywood director, she saw him as a man. For Rachel, the lines between professional and personal had blurred long ago. She told herself she wasn't breaking any rules, she was simply following her heart. But deep down, she knew the truth. Every time she looked at Jonathan's wedding ring, she felt a pang of guilt, quickly drowned out by the thrill of being chosen by someone so out of reach. As the weeks passed, Lillian's loneliness turned into suspicion. She began to notice the small details, the faint scent of an unfamiliar perfume clinging to Jonathan's jacket, the way he suddenly guarded his phone like a lifeline, the late-night texts he claimed were just work. Every piece of evidence was a dagger to her already fragile heart. She tried to save their marriage the only way she knew how, through grand gestures. She organized a surprise weekend getaway to Napa Valley, hoping to rekindle the romance. Jonathan agreed but spent most of the trip answering calls and typing emails. Lillian's attempts to bridge the gap only seemed to widen it. By August, Lillian had stopped trying. The woman who had once commanded rooms with her confidence now avoided social events altogether. When she looked at Jonathan, all she saw was a stranger, a man who no longer loved her, or perhaps, had never truly loved her at all. Lillian's world, once so meticulously crafted, was falling apart. But she wasn't ready to let it crumble without answers. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. The doubts she had suppressed for months now consumed her. And so, with trembling hands and a heavy heart, she made a decision that would set everything in motion. She hired a private investigator. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, his every move was now being watched. And what Lillian discovered in the weeks that followed would not only confirm her worst fears but ignite a chain of events that would shatter their lives forever. By April 2022, the Everett's marriage had become a shell of its former self. Jonathan buried himself in his work, spending long hours at his studio in Culver City, while Lillian drifted further into isolation. Their shared moments were reduced to formal exchanges at social events or polite nods over hurried breakfasts. Beneath the glamorous exterior of their lives, the rift between them grew wider with each passing day. It was during one of those long days at the studio that Jonathan began noticing Rachel Dawson in a different light. She had been working as his personal assistant for a few months, and her efficiency and attention to detail had quickly earned his trust. Rachel seemed to anticipate his needs before he even voiced them. She was sharp, ambitious, and always ready with a solution when the demands of Hollywood threatened to overwhelm him. For Rachel, working for Jonathan Everett was a dream come true. She had spent her college years idolizing his films, and now she was in the same room as him every day, managing his chaotic schedule and absorbing every piece of advice he inadvertently gave. What began as professional admiration slowly morphed into something deeper. Rachel found herself drawn to Jonathan, not just his talent but his vulnerability. She saw a man weighed down by expectations, someone who seemed to carry the world on his shoulders. One late evening in May 2022, Rachel stayed behind to help Jonathan finalize edits for his latest film. The rest of the studio staff had gone home, leaving the two of them alone in the dimly lit editing room. Jonathan sat slouched in his chair, staring blankly at the screen. "You're not going to get anywhere tonight if you keep pushing yourself like this," Rachel said gently, placing a coffee cup beside him. Jonathan looked up, surprised. Her concern felt genuine, untainted by the transactional nature of most of his professional relationships. "You're probably right," he admitted with a weak smile. "It's just, there's always more to do. More to prove." Rachel hesitated before replying, her voice soft. "You don't have to prove anything. Your work speaks for itself. Everyone already knows you're a genius." The word genius caught him off guard. Lillian hadn't called him that in years. Jonathan chuckled, a rare, unguarded moment. "You're kind to say that, Rachel. But sometimes I feel like I'm just holding everything together with duct tape and prayer." Rachel laughed, a sound that felt surprisingly comforting in the sterile room. For the first time in months, Jonathan allowed himself to relax. The conversation flowed easily after that, about movies, dreams, and the sacrifices that came with success. When Jonathan finally glanced at his watch, it was past midnight. "I should let you go," he said, standing up. "You've done more than enough for one day." Rachel lingered for a moment before nodding. "Good night, Jonathan." It was a simple exchange, but as Rachel left the studio that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. And neither could Jonathan. Over the following weeks, their relationship began to change in subtle ways. Jonathan started relying on Rachel for more than just scheduling. She became his confidant, the person he turned to when the pressures of work or his strained marriage became too much to bear. Rachel, in turn, found herself craving his attention. She began dressing more carefully for work, choosing outfits that subtly highlighted her features. She started staying later, volunteering for tasks that required close collaboration. The professional boundary that had once defined their relationship slowly eroded, replaced by stolen glances and lingering conversations. By June 2022, what had been an emotional connection turned physical. It happened during another late night at the studio. Jonathan had been venting about a particularly stressful meeting, and Rachel had been listening, her eyes fixed on him with unwavering empathy. Without thinking, Jonathan leaned in, and Rachel didn't pull away. "It's not right," Jonathan whispered afterward, his voice heavy with guilt. "I'm married." Rachel, still catching her breath, replied softly, "I know. But I care about you, Jonathan. I can't pretend I don't." Neither of them called it an affair, at least not out loud. They justified it in different ways. Jonathan told himself it was an escape, a way to feel alive again. Rachel convinced herself it was love, that Jonathan had finally found someone who truly understood him. But deep down, both of them knew the truth. They were playing with fire. Jonathan's attempts to keep the affair hidden only deepened the strain on his marriage. Lillian, who had already grown suspicious of his late nights, began noticing other signs: the way he guarded his phone, the perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his clothes, the text messages he quickly swiped away when she entered the room. One evening in July 2022, while Jonathan was out, working late, Lillian found herself staring at their wedding photo on the mantel. She had been so proud of their life together, so certain they were invincible. Now, that certainty felt like a cruel joke. She clenched her fists, willing herself not to cry. Something was wrong, and she was determined to find out what. Meanwhile, Rachel was growing restless. She had hoped Jonathan would see her as more than just an escape. She dreamed of a future with him, free from the shadows of secrecy. But Jonathan wasn't ready to make that leap. His guilt over betraying Lillian and his fear of public scandal kept him tethered to his double life. The affair, once thrilling and liberating, began to feel suffocating. Rachel started pushing Jonathan to make a choice. "I can't keep doing this, Jonathan. I need to know where we stand." Jonathan, torn between his love for Rachel and his duty to his family, promised her the one thing he couldn't deliver: "Just give me time." As the summer wore on, the tension between the three of them, Jonathan, Rachel, and Lillian, became unbearable. Jonathan struggled to juggle his growing feelings for Rachel with his crumbling marriage. Rachel, frustrated by Jonathan's indecision, began contemplating drastic measures. And Lillian, driven by suspicion and heartbreak, decided she could no longer sit idly by. By the end of August 2022, the stage was set for confrontation. Each secret, each lie, each stolen moment was a thread in a web of deceit that was growing tighter and tighter. None of them could have predicted how devastating the unraveling would be. By the end of September 2022, Laura Everett had reached her breaking point. The unanswered questions, the late nights, the guarded phone, it was all too much. What had once been a nagging suspicion had transformed into an all-consuming need to uncover the truth. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, and Laura was done being placated by Jonathan's empty reassurances. One evening, as Jonathan left for yet another late-night meeting, Laura sat alone in their sprawling Beverly Hills living room. The silence of the house pressed down on her. She poured herself a glass of wine, but it did nothing to soothe the storm raging inside. Finally, with trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed the number of a private investigator she had been recommended weeks earlier. "Detective Samuel Carter," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her decision. "I need your help. It's about my husband." Detective Carter was a man known for his discretion and thoroughness. Laura met him the next day at a quiet cafe in Santa Monica, far from the prying eyes of Beverly Hills. She arrived early, dressed inconspicuously in a simple black sweater and sunglasses. The usual confidence that defined her public persona was replaced by a vulnerability she could no longer hide. As they sat across from each other, Laura laid everything out: Jonathan's late nights, his abrupt changes in behavior, the distant look in his eyes that had become all too familiar. "I know there's someone else," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I just don't have proof." Carter nodded, taking notes as she spoke. "I'll find out what's going on, Mrs. Everett. But I need you to prepare yourself. Once I start digging, I might uncover things you're not ready to hear." Laura looked him straight in the eye. "I'm ready." Over the next 2 weeks, Carter followed Jonathan meticulously. The detective's first breakthrough came when he observed Jonathan meeting Rachel Dawson at a small cafe in West Hollywood. It wasn't just the meeting itself that raised red flags, it was the way they interacted. The stolen glances, the quiet laughter, the subtle but unmistakable intimacy between them. The next evening, Carter followed Jonathan to a nondescript apartment building in West Hollywood. There, he watched as Rachel arrived shortly after Jonathan, carrying what appeared to be an overnight bag. The lights in the apartment flickered on, and for hours, there was no sign of either of them leaving. Carter documented everything: photos of Jonathan opening the door for Rachel, timestamps of their meetings, and even a recording of their voices through the thin apartment walls, where Rachel could be heard laughing softly at something Jonathan said. It was undeniable. This wasn't just a fling, it was an affair. When Carter presented his findings to Laura in mid-October, she was sitting in the same cafe where they had first met. He slid a manila folder across the table, his expression cautious. "Everything you need to know is in here." Laura hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. Part of her wanted to push it away, to pretend this wasn't happening. But she couldn't live in ignorance any longer. With a deep breath, she opened it. The photos were the first thing she saw: Jonathan and Rachel sitting close together at the cafe, Rachel leaning into him with a smile that Laura hadn't seen in years. Then came the images of them entering the West Hollywood apartment, their expressions relaxed and carefree. The timestamps confirmed that Jonathan had lied about every late meeting he'd attended in the past month. But it was the texts that cut the deepest. Carter had managed to retrieve messages from Rachel's phone, exchanged late at night when Jonathan was supposedly working. "Rachel, I can't wait until we don't have to sneak around anymore. I want us to have a real life together." "Jonathan, I know. Just a little longer. I'll figure it out." "Rachel, you always say that. Don't you want to be happy too?" Laura's hands shook as she read the words, each one a dagger to her heart. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life with, had not only betrayed her but had promised a future to another woman. That night, Laura sat alone in their bedroom, the folder of evidence spread out on the bed before her. The images and texts seemed to mock her, each one a painful reminder of how far their marriage had fallen. For hours, she replayed every moment from the past year, searching for signs she had missed. The late nights, the distracted looks, the sudden enthusiasm for a new cologne, it all made sense now. But along with the pain came something else: anger. How dare he humiliate her like this? How dare he take everything they had built together and throw it away for someone like Rachel Dawson, a woman who had no idea what it meant to sacrifice for a marriage. Laura wiped her tears and stood, her reflection in the mirror almost unrecognizable. This wasn't who she was. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't going to let Jonathan or Rachel destroy her life without consequences. She picked up her phone and dialed Carter again. "I need more," she said, her voice cold and steady. "I want to know everything. Where they meet, what they talk about, every single detail." "Are you sure, Mrs. Everett?" Carter asked. "What you already have is more than enough." "It's not enough," Laura snapped. "I want them both to feel what I'm feeling right now. And when the time comes, I'll make sure they do." From that moment, Laura began planning her next move. She wouldn't confront Jonathan yet, not until she had the perfect opportunity. She wanted him to see the full extent of what he had done, to feel the weight of his betrayal. And as for Rachel, Laura intended to make sure she regretted ever stepping into her marriage. As the days passed, Laura's pain transformed into determination. She began to mask her emotions, smiling at Jonathan as though nothing had changed, playing the role of the supportive wife at public events. But beneath the facade, she was calculating every step, waiting for the right moment to strike. The truth had been exposed, but for Laura Everett, this was only the beginning. The evening of December 10, 2022, began with an air of calm, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. The Everett mansion in Beverly Hills was aglow with soft golden light, casting long shadows across its pristine marble floors. The dining room was a vision of perfection, with its long mahogany table set meticulously by Laura Everett herself. Fine china gleamed under the chandelier, and the aroma of a lavishly prepared dinner wafted through the air. It was the kind of setting that belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Yet, for Laura, it was a stage, one she had prepared with precision for the confrontation to come. Jonathan arrived home first, as he always did, still oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He stepped into the house, loosening his tie as he called out, "Laura? This smells amazing. What's the occasion?" Laura appeared in the doorway, wearing an elegant black dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Her makeup was understated yet flawless, her hair swept back into a sleek bun. She smiled, the picture of grace, but her eyes held a steely determination. "I thought we deserved a nice evening," she said, placing a delicate kiss on his cheek. "It's been too long since we sat down together, just the two of us, or almost the two of us." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "Almost? Rachel's joining us," Laura said casually, turning back toward the kitchen. "I thought it would be nice to thank her for all her hard work." Jonathan froze. A flicker of panic flashed across his face before he forced a smile. "That's thoughtful of you," he said, though his voice betrayed him. When Rachel Dawson arrived 15 minutes later, the atmosphere shifted. Dressed in a modest but stylish outfit, Rachel hesitated at the door, her usual confidence dampened by an inexplicable unease. She hadn't expected an invitation to dinner at the Everett household and had almost declined. But Jonathan had assured her over text earlier that day, "Just come. She wants to thank you. Nothing to worry about." Rachel stepped into the house, greeted by the dazzling warmth of Laura's hospitality. "Rachel, you look lovely," Laura said, extending a hand. Her tone was sweet, but Rachel detected an edge she couldn't quite place. "Thank you, Mrs. Everett," Rachel replied, glancing nervously at Jonathan, who stood awkwardly in the background. "This is very kind of you." "Nonsense," Laura said, leading her into the dining room. "You've done so much for Jonathan. It's the least I could do." As they sat down, the table felt impossibly large despite only seating 3. The initial conversation was polite, almost stiff, with Laura guiding the small talk. She asked Rachel about her work, her family, her goals. Rachel answered carefully, acutely aware of Jonathan's silence and the occasional piercing glance Laura shot in his direction. By the time the main course was served, the cracks in Laura's composure began to show. Her smile became tighter, her voice carried a sharpness that wasn't there before. "So, Rachel," Laura said, swirling the wine in her glass. "You must spend a lot of time with Jonathan. Late nights, weekends, he's always so busy." Rachel nearly choked on her sip of water. "Oh, well, yes. His schedule is very demanding. How fortunate he has someone like you to support him," Laura continued, her tone light but her eyes razor-sharp. She turned to Jonathan, who looked like he wanted to sink into his chair. "I don't know how you manage without me around." Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but Laura didn't give him the chance. "You see, I've noticed how much happier he's been lately," she said, her voice dropping just enough to send a chill through the room. "It's as if some outside influence has given him a new lease on life." Rachel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Jonathan for reassurance, but he was staring fixedly at his plate. "Mrs. Everett," Rachel began, trying to sound composed, "I assure you, my relationship with Jonathan is purely professional." "Is it?" Laura's voice was a blade now, cutting through the pretense. She leaned forward, her eyes boring into Rachel's. "I know, Rachel. I know about the West Hollywood apartment. I know about the late nights, the promises, the lies." Rachel's face turned ashen. I don't know what you're talking about." Jonathan finally found his voice. "Laura, that's enough. This isn't enough?" Laura snapped, her composure shattering. "Enough? Do you think this is enough, Jonathan? You lied to me. You betrayed me. And you," she turned back to Rachel, venom dripping from her words, "you knew he was married. You knew, and you didn't care." The room descended into chaos. Rachel stammered, her words a jumble of denials and apologies. Jonathan tried to calm Laura, but his guilt rendered him powerless. "I never meant to hurt you," Rachel pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I love him." "You love him?" Laura laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You don't even know him. You think he'll leave me for you? You're nothing to him." "Laura, stop it!" Jonathan shouted, standing up. "This has gone far enough." But Laura wasn't listening. Her hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, her knuckles white against the delicate stem. "You think you can just walk into my life, destroy everything, and get away with it?" Rachel tried to stand, but Laura slammed her hand on the table, making the glassware rattle. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. Jonathan moved to intervene, but before he could, Laura's gaze shifted. Her eyes locked onto the kitchen counter, where a gleaming chef's knife lay next to the cutting board. Her breath quickened as rage and despair consumed her. "Laura, don't," Jonathan warned, but it was too late. In a flash, Laura grabbed the knife and pointed it at Rachel, her hand trembling but resolute. "You've taken everything from me," she hissed, tears streaming down her face. "You ruined my family, my marriage, my life." "Laura, please," Rachel begged, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean." The next moments unfolded in a blur of movement, screams, and desperation. The confrontation that had simmered all evening erupted into tragedy, leaving blood on the pristine marble floor and lives shattered beyond repair. The aftermath of the dinner was a nightmare etched into Jonathan Everett's memory. The pristine elegance of the Everett mansion was now tainted by blood and chaos. Rachel Dawson lay motionless on the cold marble floor, her lifeless eyes staring into the void. The echoes of her last breath hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the distant wail of approaching sirens. Laura Everett stood frozen, the chef's knife trembling in her blood-streaked hand. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her breath ragged as the weight of her actions crushed her. For a moment, the room was suspended in eerie silence, as if time itself had stopped to bear witness to the destruction wrought by betrayal, rage, and heartbreak. Jonathan dropped to his knees beside Rachel's body, his hands pressing futilely against the wound in her chest. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice thick with desperation. "Rachel, stay with me. Please." Blood pooled around them, stark against the white marble floor, a cruel reminder of how irreparable the moment had become. "Jonathan," Laura's voice broke through the haze, soft and trembling. I didn't mean to." Jonathan looked up at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief, fury, and anguish. "What have you done, Laura? What have you done?" As the wail of sirens grew louder, Jonathan's instincts kicked in. He stood abruptly, grabbing Laura by the shoulders. "We have to fix this," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They can't find out. They'll destroy us, Laura. Everything we've built." Laura shook her head, her tears falling freely. "Fix this?" she whispered, incredulous. "Jonathan, I just killed her. There's no fixing this." "You weren't thinking clearly," he said, his grip tightening. "It was an accident. You didn't mean to. We'll tell them it was a break-in, a robbery gone wrong." Laura wrenched herself free, staring at him in horror. "A break-in? You want to lie about this? After everything?" Jonathan's face twisted with desperation. "If we don't, they'll take you away. Do you understand that? They'll take you away from me. From everything." But Laura's gaze shifted back to Rachel's body, the enormity of what had happened sinking in. "Jonathan," she said softly, her voice hollow, "she's dead. And it's my fault." Despite Laura's protests, Jonathan sprang into action. His hands moved quickly, wiping surfaces, scattering items around the room to simulate a struggle. He shattered a vase near the window and flung it open, creating the illusion of forced entry. His mind raced with the details, driven not by malice but by sheer survival instinct. Laura watched in numb silence, the knife still dangling from her hand. "Put that down," Jonathan snapped, pointing at the blade. She hesitated before placing it on the counter. Jonathan grabbed a dish towel, wiped the handle clean, and shoved it into a drawer. His movements were frantic, each decision laced with the fear of consequences they couldn't afford to face. "Go upstairs," he instructed, his voice trembling. "Change your clothes. Wash your hands. Make it look like you've been asleep." "No," Laura whispered, shaking her head. I can't do this." "You don't have a choice," he said sharply. "We don't have a choice." Minutes later, the police arrived. Jonathan greeted them at the door, his expression a mask of shock and devastation. "I just got home," he said, his voice cracking. "The door was open. I found her like this." Detective Samuel Carter, the lead investigator, stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "Your wife?" he asked. "She's upstairs," Jonathan replied quickly. "She was asleep. She doesn't know." Carter's gaze lingered on Jonathan, noting the subtle signs of unease, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted away with every question. But Jonathan's grief seemed genuine enough, and for the moment, Carter focused on the evidence. As the forensic team documented the scene, Laura stood at the top of the staircase, watching through the railing. She wanted to scream, to confess, to end the crushing weight of guilt that threatened to suffocate her. But the fear in Jonathan's eyes held her back. She gripped the banister, her knuckles white, as the officers carried Rachel's body out on a stretcher. The days that followed were a blur. The media descended upon the Everetts like vultures, their cameras and microphones pointed at the mansion as headlines screamed, "Tragedy in Beverly Hills, Director's Secretary Killed in Robbery Gone Wrong." Inside, Laura felt herself unraveling. She barely slept, haunted by Rachel's final moments and the sight of her blood pooling on the marble floor. Jonathan, on the other hand, threw himself into damage control, managing the narrative with the precision of a seasoned filmmaker. He gave a tearful statement to the press, played the grieving employer, and begged for privacy. "You're going to have to pull yourself together," Jonathan told Laura one evening, his voice laced with frustration. "People are watching. They can't see you like this." Laura stared at him, her eyes hollow. "How can you act like this is just another problem to solve? She's dead, Jonathan. And it's my fault." "You made a mistake," he said, his tone softening. "But we can't undo it. We have to protect what's left." "What's left?" Laura whispered. "There's nothing left, Jonathan. Nothing." By December 14, 2022, Laura could no longer bear the weight of her guilt. That morning, while Jonathan was giving yet another carefully crafted statement to the press, Laura drove herself to the Beverly Hills Police Department. Detective Carter looked up from his desk as she walked in, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Mrs. Everett," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Laura hesitated for only a moment before speaking. I need to tell you something." "What is it?" Carter asked, leaning forward. She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I killed her," she said. "Rachel Dawson. It wasn't a robbery. It was me." Laura's confession sent shockwaves through Hollywood and the media. Jonathan's carefully constructed narrative crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The public, once enamored with the Everetts, now turned on them with relentless scrutiny. As Laura awaited trial, Jonathan found himself utterly alone, his career in ruins and his reputation destroyed. The glamorous life they had built together was gone, replaced by a reality they could never escape, a reality where love, betrayal, and rage had led to a single tragic moment that shattered everything. The morning after Laura Everett's shocking confession, the headlines across America exploded like a wildfire. Hollywood power couple falls, Laura Everett admits to murder. The world watched as the once revered philanthropist and wife of famed director Jonathan Everett was escorted into the Beverly Hills courthouse, her face a portrait of resignation and sorrow. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every step of her descent into infamy. Inside the courthouse, Detective Samuel Carter pieced together the puzzle of the tragic evening. Laura had confessed to stabbing Rachel Dawson during an emotional outburst, but Carter couldn't shake the sense that the story wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Something about Jonathan's demeanor during the initial investigation, the rushed nature of the supposed break-in, and Laura's insistence on taking full blame left him uneasy. In the weeks following her arrest, Laura's trial became a media circus. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some sympathized with her, painting her as a woman driven to the edge by betrayal and heartbreak. Others vilified her, calling her a cold-blooded murderer who had lashed out in jealousy. Jonathan Everett, however, remained an enigma. He avoided the press and issued only brief statements through his legal team, pleading for privacy and asking the public to remember the devastating loss of Rachel Dawson. Behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly to distance himself from the scandal, more concerned about preserving what little remained of his career than supporting his wife. Laura, meanwhile, refused to cooperate with her defense team's attempts to shift the blame to Jonathan. "This was my choice," she told them during a private meeting. "I let my emotions take control. He had nothing to do with it." But the cracks in her resolve began to show during cross-examinations. Under pressure, she admitted to the months of betrayal she had endured, her growing suspicions about Jonathan and Rachel, and her decision to confront them at the now infamous dinner. "Why invite Rachel to your home if you knew about the affair?" the prosecutor asked sharply. Laura hesitated, her voice trembling. "Because I wanted them to see. I wanted them to know I wasn't blind. That I couldn't be pushed aside." "And yet, you stabbed her," the prosecutor pressed. Tears streamed down Laura's face as she whispered, "I didn't plan to. I didn't mean to." Midway through the trial, an unexpected revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. One of Detective Carter's forensic experts testified that several elements of the crime scene appeared staged. The broken vase near the window wasn't consistent with a struggle, the expert explained. It looks like it was deliberately placed there after the fact. And the knife handle, there were no prints. It had been wiped clean. The prosecutor's gaze shifted to Jonathan, who sat in the gallery, his face impassive. "Mr. Everett," the prosecutor said, rising to address him, "can you explain why the crime scene might have been manipulated?" Jonathan's lawyer objected immediately, but the damage was done. Whispers rippled through the courtroom as the spotlight turned to Jonathan, raising questions about his involvement, or, at the very least, what he had done to protect himself. Days after the forensic revelations, a handwritten letter from Laura emerged, leaked anonymously to the press. The letter, addressed to Detective Carter, shed new light on her confession. "Detective Carter. I don't know if I'll have the strength to say this out loud, so I'm putting it here. What I told you that night, it was the truth, but not the whole truth. I did stab Rachel, and I will carry that guilt with me for the rest of my life. But Jonathan isn't innocent. He orchestrated everything after it happened. He cleaned the scene, told me what to say, and convinced me that taking the blame was the only way to save us both. I agreed because I thought I still loved him. But now I see he was saving himself, not me. Please, don't let him walk away from this unscathed. He's not the man everyone thinks he is." The letter sparked a renewed investigation into Jonathan's actions that night. Detective Carter, driven by Laura's words, revisited the evidence, piecing together Jonathan's calculated attempts to rewrite the narrative. As the trial drew to a close, Jonathan was called to the stand, his composed demeanor beginning to crack under relentless questioning. "You wiped the knife," the prosecutor accused. "You staged the break-in. You manipulated your wife into taking the blame. Didn't you?" Jonathan's carefully crafted mask faltered. "I was trying to protect her," he said, his voice breaking. She wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't want her to suffer." "Or were you trying to protect yourself?" the prosecutor shot back. "Your career? Your reputation?" The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the question hanging heavy in the air. In the end, Laura was sentenced to 10 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter. Her composure during sentencing surprised even her harshest critics. As she was led away, she turned to the gallery, her gaze briefly meeting Jonathan's. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a resigned understanding of the choices that had led them both here. Jonathan, though not formally charged, faced the court of public opinion. His reputation was irreparably tarnished. Studios dropped him from ongoing projects, and former colleagues distanced themselves. The whispers of his manipulation, coupled with Laura's letter, left a permanent stain on his once illustrious career. Months after the trial, Jonathan sat alone in the empty mansion, now stripped of its warmth and life. The once luxurious home felt cavernous, echoing with the memories of what had been lost. On the kitchen counter lay a copy of Laura's letter, its words a constant reminder of the price they had both paid for their choices. Laura, from her prison cell, began writing a memoir. Her story, she decided, would not just be one of betrayal and tragedy but also of accountability and the strength to face one's demons. The public moved on to the next scandal, but the story of Jonathan and Laura Everett remained a cautionary tale. It was a story of love turned sour, of ambition and deception, and of the devastating consequences of secrets too long buried. For those who knew the Everetts, one question lingered, unanswered: who bore the greater guilt, the one who wielded the knife, or the one who tried to rewrite the truth? As the dust settled over the Everett scandal, the once glorious lives of Jonathan and Laura Everett became relics of Hollywood's darkest cautionary tale. What was left were echoes of a story where love, betrayal, ambition, and guilt collided, leaving destruction in their wake. Jonathan Everett, once a name synonymous with brilliance in filmmaking, became a ghost of his former self. The studios that once courted him now avoided him like the plague. Projects he had poured years of his life into were shelved indefinitely, and colleagues who had once sung his praises now refused to be associated with his name. He wandered the now empty halls of the Beverly Hills mansion, the memories of happier times haunting every room. The dining table where the infamous dinner had taken place was gone, he had it removed, unable to look at the space where Rachel's blood had once stained the floor. Yet the absence of it only made the void in his life feel larger. Jonathan tried to write, to create again, but every attempt was drowned by the weight of public scrutiny and his own guilt. His nights were sleepless, haunted by the image of Rachel's wide, unblinking eyes staring up at him, her voice whispering from his nightmares, "You promised." For Laura Everett, life behind bars was an odd mixture of liberation and confinement. The prison walls were stark and unyielding, but within them, Laura felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, she was free from the facade of perfection she had maintained for the cameras, the galas, and even her husband. Here, she could simply exist, no longer weighed down by the suffocating expectations of being Mrs. Jonathan Everett. She spent her days writing, pouring her thoughts into journals that would one day form her memoir. In her writing, she explored not only her pain and betrayal but also the choices she had made, both good and bad, that had led her here. For Laura, her story wasn't just a tale of tragedy, it was a testament to the strength it took to face the consequences of one's actions. Occasionally, she received letters from Jonathan. They were carefully worded, full of regret and apologies, but Laura rarely replied. His words felt hollow now, and she no longer needed them to find peace. She had made her choice, and she was determined to own it. The public fascination with the Everett case lingered long after the trial ended. True crime podcasts dissected every detail, from Rachel's ambitions to Jonathan's manipulations to Laura's dramatic confession. Documentaries speculated about what had truly happened that night, interviewing former friends and colleagues who offered conflicting accounts of Jonathan and Laura's characters. Who was the real villain? Was it Laura, who had succumbed to a moment of blind rage? Or Jonathan, whose lies and ambition had set the stage for tragedy? Or Rachel, whose choices, some would argue, were the spark that ignited the fire? Social media buzzed with debates, and the Everett story became a cultural phenomenon. But as the world moved on, the individuals at the center of the scandal were left to navigate their broken lives alone. In the end, there were no winners in the story of Jonathan, Laura, and Rachel. Each of them had made choices that led them down a path of destruction, and each paid a heavy price. The love that had once bound Jonathan and Laura together had become a chain of resentment and regret. Rachel's ambition had turned into her downfall. And the life they had all envisioned for themselves, glamorous, successful, and fulfilling, was shattered beyond repair. Jonathan remained in his empty mansion, a relic of Hollywood's unforgiving spotlight. Laura remained behind bars, her days filled with reflection and quiet determination to rebuild herself, even if from within the confines of prison. Rachel's memory lingered in the public consciousness, a symbol of the price of ambition and secrecy. The question that lingered for years was one that no one could definitively answer: was this tragedy inevitable, or was it preventable? And if it was preventable, where had it all gone wrong? What about you? Who do you think bears the greatest blame in this tragic story? Was it Jonathan, whose lies and betrayal set everything into motion? Was it Rachel, whose ambition and relationship with a married man brought her into the line of fire? Or was it Laura, whose explosive actions turned betrayal into bloodshed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe this story could have ended differently? If so, how? And finally, if you were in Laura's position, what would you have done? We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to share your opinions and theories below. Also, subscribe to our channel for more gripping true crime stories like this one. See you next time.